All right, let's get started with discussion of chapter 1 through 3 of Dead Souls. I'm tempted to open, I don't know how, whether people come with comments on the tips of their tongues, but I'm curious to know whether people had read this before, how they feel about it at first glance from having read the first 3 chapters, whether you're excited about this selection, whether you're perplexed by it and wondering whether it's going to be worthwhile. I don't know. And I would like to just open the floor to general reactions if I could. Brian.
So I haven't read likely nearly as many Russian novels as you have, Lisa, but there's a genre. It kind of feels like the Emily Bronte style. They have a genre of their own. But going into it, the first few chapters, it's all about posturing among the rich that don't seem to do much. And it's usually about men in the Russian novels, and it's usually about women in the Bronte British kind of novels. And it seems to be so pedantic, and there's not a lot of connection with the actual reality of getting things done. And then after you have that traditional Russian introduction, they then take you into this bizarre guy buying dead people. So I don't know what to think right now, because part of me was thinking, oh no, if this is another Dostoevsky, I'm done. Like I don't want to do.
Definitely not Dostoevsky. I can tell you that much.
So that was my version.
So okay, other thoughts? Ray.
Yeah, I haven't read Gogol. Well, I read a few short stories by Gogol before, which were fun, and very much fit in this atmosphere. But basically, I mean, I'm just really loving this. I mean, everything is a step down after Madame Bovary, but but it just the sheer frivolousness of it, just that. And I texted you the other day about this, but I don't know how to summarize Gogol's sense of life, but the emblem of it is a turkey gobbling "God bless you." That's, like, it's just so absurd. It's so playful. It's just the, I don't know, just like the little things that are like very tedious, but just funny because they're tedious. Like in the first chapter, it's like the two serfs, I don't know what they are, but they're just looking off at the carriage, and they just say like, "Oh, quite the wheel. You think they could go to Moscow? Yes, it could go to Moscow, but not as far as Kazan. No, not Kazan." It's just wonderful. Or there's the one like giving directions, like, "You're looking for Zamanilov? Well, there's no Zamanil." Just he keeps repeating it. He can't get over the fact he just has that peasant banality.
Well, I have a long list of those moments in my notes, all of which I think people will recall, and it will make them chuckle. And one of my questions is going to be, what is he mocking in this moment? And sometimes it's hard to precisely identify, and sometimes it feels like it's more just to capture a kind of atmosphere. But let's hold off on that for a minute, and we'll come back to
it. I love it. It's just so much fun.
It is fun. Sarah.
I'm also really enjoying this. I took a Russian short stories class in college, which I did not do well in. It's not really my area. And I also realized that short is definitely a misnomer for what stories we were reading. Anyway, I have read Gogol before, never this work, and I feel like he was my favorite of the authors that we read in that class, and so I'm really glad to return to it. But I feel like the reason I love it is those little moments, and like for me, the one that just really, it was the moment when I was like, all right, I'm gonna really enjoy this novel, was the kiss so prolonged that you could smoke a cigar. And it's just little touches like that just charming. They're very charming.
But sort of formulaic and without passion.
Yes.
Just long. Because they were as they say, happy. I think that the phrasing was something like that. That word, the way they call people happy, they were that. Shoshana.
Yeah, well, I of course read it. I've read it before. I read it in Russian years ago. I didn't read it in Russian this time. I did bring along my copy, but I've never actually taught it because it's long,
Yeah.
and one of the things about Gogol is that you want to slow down and enjoy all the funny things he's doing. I guess one thing that I would say I especially enjoyed this time, and maybe some of you would also enjoy it, is just noticing the narrator, because
Mhm.
it's not a transparent narrator. This is a narrator who's really trying to do a good job here and doesn't really know how to do a good job, and doesn't start out by giving you the major premise is, why are we looking? Dead souls is not actually a metaphysical statement about ghosts. It's a practical thing, and it's like a pun on the word souls, which gradually you find out. And I just think it's funny that we it's episodic, and that we go from place to place, and it's almost like one of those stories where like on a Saturday Night Live or something, where there's some ridiculous premise, and it has to be re-explained to each group of people, and that's kind of where we are. So I think I think it's funny. I think there's a reason why he had trouble doing the second volume of it, because how do you live for years in the mind of this story? And I did bring one thing just in case. I don't know if it'll show. I don't know if you can see. That's what the first edition looked like.
Okay, I can barely see.
Your fiduci.
Yeah. And what you see is that that big black word is poema. He's calling it a poem. The big letters are dead souls, and the little letters are the adventures of Chichikov, because the censors were a little worried about what is this about dead souls. But a title like Chichikov's Adventures, that was something they could accept.
Okay.
And he's got his name kind of small, almost as if he's hiding himself. And I just thought that was, it's almost as if it's a work of art that stands for the work of art. Is that it's dead souls, but he really wants to make you think of it as a poem, like that you slow down and it's epic, and so, which of course it isn't, and that he's got to add that bit about Chichikov's adventures, because I'll stop here, but these are not what you ordinarily think of as adventures. I'm reading an adventure novel. What's he doing? He's going from one estate to another, trying to buy up dead souls, each time having to deal with
Explain it. And then his cart toppling over in the mud in between. If it's an adventure, it's quite if it's an epic, it's quite a homey little epic. Okay, Mary Aline.
This is Darwin. It's kind of
at a certain point, it looked like you were holding your arm up like this to ask a question, and then I realized it was your cat's tail.
Yeah, he's feeling neglected because I was out of town for a while. It's kind of a comedy of manners, and everybody, there's all these levels of status that seem kind of asinine, and everybody is all absorbed in what everybody else thinks. And yet at this point, I find it hard to really care about any of the characters. It's like nobody has any really passion in life except making an impression on everybody else. And yet, in some ways, it's really funny.
Well, okay, thank you very much. I appreciate everyone's opening comments. They're really helpful to me. I don't know how many of you read The Cloak or The Overcoat, which is in the Read With Me app, another Gogol story. And I had the experience reading that, of kind of going through stages and iterations of my understanding and appreciation of it. And if you have listened to my commentary on that story, you'll know that ultimately I came to, it's just really damn funny. I mean, that's the fundamental of it. It's really funny. Yes, there is social commentary contained within it, and the social commentary is important, but I came away with a much greater focus on and appreciation for the humor of it. And I had the same experience all over again, reading these first few chapters. I have not finished this book. I hesitate to say novel because, as Shoshana just mentioned, he called it a poem. And I did very little reading about it because I don't want spoilers and I don't want my expectations set before I finish it. But I did read a couple of things which made it clear that, you know, conventional novelistic structure is not what we are to expect from this novel, from this book. And that, you know, surreal is even a term attached to it sometimes. Now, I don't think it's, well, anyway, I'll leave it at that. So yeah, if you're expecting Mary Elaine to get attached to a character and to be driven by an integrated plot, that probably won't keep you going. But if I like Shoshana's description of an SNL sketch, where it's just absolutely hysterically funny. And I do want to draw out some of the humor in this discussion, because I think we have to sort of start to speak the language of Gogol's humor, or we can overlook even what's so funny about it. And I know one thing Grace mentioned to me personally was that she started reading two copies side by side and noticed that in one translation something would be hysterically funny, and in another it would seem to be, the humor would seem to be overlooked. So I imagine reading it in the original, you get a lot more in the original Russian, you get a lot more of the humor than even we do in any of the translations, because a lot of it probably defies translation even. So so a couple of things about just sort of general observations about the book. First, I want to confess to a couple apprehensions I had about even discussing it. One is, I've mentioned this at some point in one of the Read With Me discussions. It's what I call the Chris Farley problem, which, funny enough, is a Saturday Night Live sketch that I'm referring to. But there's this classic sketch with Chris Farley where he's the like consummately awful interviewer. He's terrible at interviewing. So he'll have a celebrity sit down next to him and he'll say, "Remember that time you did this?" And they'll say, "Yeah, I remember that." And he'll say, "That was cool." And then he has nothing else to say about it. And then, later in the interview, he is reduced to saying, "Remember when I asked you this question in the interview a little while?" That was cool. So part of the challenge of this kind of episodic, very funny sort of book, I'm finding it completely delightful to read, but to discuss it is really difficult, because I feel like I'm going to be reduced to saying to you, "Remember the time he did this really funny thing? That was hilarious." And so I hope that won't be what our discussion is reduced to. If it is, we'll just cut it a little bit short and go read on our own. The second thing, and related to that, there's no greater way to kill a joke than to analyze and discuss it. So I'm also apprehensive about talking about all the really, really funny things that happen and trying to get underneath them, and thereby just kind of robbing them of everything that made them funny. But I do want to talk about a lot of the examples of the funniest things, because it's interesting to me to consider what he's parodying. Sometimes I get a feel or a general sense of what he's parodying in those moments, but to try to formulate it in words is challenging, and I think maybe a useful exercise. So I'd like to try it at least with some of them. So a couple of things that I did read about it that I found very helpful in terms of kind of orienting my enjoyment of an understanding of this novel. One was that, in the introduction of the Pevere and Volokhonsky, which I don't have, but I was able to read the introduction online, it said that it was believed that in Gogol, they had found the Russian national poet in the full sense of the word, and that everybody tried to claim him for their own in some way. But the part that was interesting to me in this introduction is it said, this all sounds very lofty and serious, but the central figure in Gogol's work is laughter, and that laughter is the primary, and that the laughter is directing us towards human foibles or faults of Russian society, but really we're in for a very comedic ride. So I wanted to mention that, Brian, because if you're going to this expecting Dostoevsky, you're going to miss all the humor of it, because it's just, there is so much, I mean, even I would say downright slapstick humor when he climbs into the feather bed and the feathers just poof out around him. It's a really funny scene to imagine, and I can picture it in a movie. But I don't think there's a whole lot of social commentary going on in that moment. It's just plain slapstick humor. A little bit of commentary maybe on the old woman who's putting him up in her home. So first of all, primary central figure is laughter. Second of all, I read that almost all the characters in this book became immediately proverbial, is the way they described it in Pevere and Volkonsky. These were like iconic characters after this. So I find it, in going back over the chapters to prepare for this discussion, the characters took a little more shape when I had to focus on them and take notes on them. And so I think trying to get sorry, I've got too many thoughts flooding my head at once. Trying to get some sort of basic central idea of each of the characters and in what way they might have become proverbial, I think would be useful. But at the same time, another thing I love about this book is that there are all these there's all this bringing out of subtle little nuances of their character that I don't think necessarily add up to or integrate into the whole. They just make them very colorful and real. So that's a challenge in identifying the central defining qualities of the characters, but it's also just a joy to read. One of the phrases I read, this is actually on Wikipedia, but I loved this phrase so much, you never know what you're going to get. It said, though the townspeople Chichikov comes across are gross caricatures, they are not flat stereotypes by any means. Instead, each is neurotically individual, combining the official failings that Gogol typically satirizes with a curious set of personal quirks. I thought that was a really good way of describing it. So there is an official failing of Russian society that he's making fun of in each of them, but also there's a lot of individual quirks to make them funny and real. I just talked for a long time. Any comments or thoughts about that, Shoshana?
Okay, this is everything you said made sense. This is just a little thing about the characterizations. He's a playwright. He's a playwright as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and not all novelists are also playwrights, and not all also novelists. But I think that has something to do with the way he writes the characters. It's as if he's trying to put them on stage in front of you.
Mm. So you see a lot of physical action on
Right. Yeah. You can imagine them, you can sort of make the stage in your head, and there they are acting in front of you. I think that has something to do with it.
That's an interesting thought. Ray.
Just in terms of the characters, well, actually, just in terms of the sense of life I'm getting, is it feels somewhere between Charlie Chaplin and Woody Allen, where it's like, it's really like fun and down and out and cheerful with and slapstick with Charlie Chaplin, but it's also got that just neurotic anxiety of Allen, certain, just this mouse-ish quality. It just says cringing of just like, oh, I'm just that one bit when he's about to describe the servants, and he says, I'm very hesitant to discuss this because I know the readership is not interested in learning about people of such a low breeding or something like that. It's just,
Yeah.
but yeah.
I love the neurosis of that. And I also feel like that's, tell me if you agree, but I feel like that's kind of central to the whole thing, is that if there's a central focus to the satire, it's this over obsession with class distinctions in Russian society. So we're obsessed. I loved the passage about how a Russian can change his manner of interacting with someone based on the finest distinctions in their social class. It's not just like a noble versus a peasant. The finest distinctions, you modify your manner of speech and talking to them. So if there's a central focus, I'd say that in all these different kind of expressions is what it is. And you even, when the narrator kind of breaks the fourth wall and speaks to you directly, he's often talking about that sort of thing too.
Yeah, I think at least that's so far been a major theme. I'm not sure if that's going to be everything, because there's just so many little details all over the place. But
I know.
One thing I just want to mention just about the narrator too is while with Flaubert, like, he's laughing at so many of the characters, and maybe it's a comparatively good natured sometimes, but here it really is like, yeah, he's making fun of the peasants, and no, it won't make it to Kazan. But there's just a sense of like, oh yeah, but he's not being mean about it. Like, this is just fun.
Yeah.
Very sympathetic. He's
Absolutely.
like, yeah, I probably do the same thing too,
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's one of the joys. One of Grace's reasons for choosing this book is that she wanted to get out of Flaubert's universe and be in one that was more benevolent for a change. And this, I think, is definitely that. In regard to that point, I found this passage really interesting where he says, and I remember in the cloak thinking, describing it as him shining a light on this person who is so completely overlooked all the time. I mean, people run into him and don't even notice him physically run into him and don't notice that he existed on the street. And I felt like Gogol was saying, no, but he's really interesting. Come on, let's take a look at him. And he's kind of delightful and quirky and fascinating in his own way. So stop plowing him over. Let's take a close look. And then, so I feel like that same spirit is coming out in this book. And there was this line in my book, it's page 22, where he says, but all the gentlemen, of whom there are so many in the world, who look so very much alike, and yet, but when you inspect them more closely, have many extremely elusive peculiarities, are fearfully difficult to describe. One has to strain one's attention to the utmost to make all the delicate, almost indiscernible traits stand out. And altogether, one needs to look deeply with an eye sharpened by long practice in the art. Now, that sounds a little bit tongue-in-cheek to me in a funny way, because it seems like he's talking about what novelists do, but also when he's saying that's not really what I do, but at the same time, I think that is what he seems to delight in doing, is really looking at someone and noticing all these peculiarities and eccentricities and capturing them in a very vivid and hilarious way. And there is a benevolence to it. It's just like, oh, they're really quirky and interesting.
I guess you could say with Flaubert, with Gogol, he's deeply empathetic. With Flaubert, it's dissective.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Brian. Oh, we can't hear you.
You're on mute, Brian.
I neglected to mention in my earlier intro that I do enjoy the descriptions. It was more that I didn't see where this is going. It just felt like another Russian novel. But talking about the narrator, the voice of the narrator reminds me of the narrator of the Book Thief movie, who is deaf. And so those voices, there's kind of this parallel resonance. Like I keep having these flashbacks to, and the, in the Book Thief movie, he is talking with the audience. He's like death, kind of talking about the process of death and collecting souls. And so there's these flashbacks to the
I don't know if other people here know it, but unfortunately the reference is lost on me because I don't know the Book Thief.
That's fine. But anyway, the other part of it, in parallel, I'm listening to your reading of Anne of Green Gables, and where she goes into the exceptional observer would notice this. And so that concept of being hyper aware of what you can deduce by really taking your time to savor the observation in detail has really not been lost on me as I'm listening to Gorgol on the audiobook.
That's great. I think so. In Anne of Green Gables, I love the phrase beauty loving eyes. So it's always an eye to like drama and beauty. And there are many novelists, writers who are kind of drawing out things that would go unobserved, but with an eye to integrating them into the essence of that person's soul. And with Gogol, it seems like, no, I'm just going to delight in the things that are kind of accidental to them, but they're still captivating and funny, especially as described in my voice. So, I mean, I guess so much of I hadn't explicitly conceptualized that till I said it. So much of it is enjoying the voice of the observer. Forget the character. It's just hearing how he observes them is what's so delightful about it. Stefan.
I was curious, when it was going to be revealed what he was doing. You know what I mean? And now I'm wondering, I thought that maybe it was going to be some sort of payoff maybe later, but it came pretty quick. So now the question is, what's going to hold the attention, I guess, now for the rest of the novel? That's kind of what struck me. But I will say the scene, because like you said, it's very lighthearted and kind of fun up to a certain point until you find out why he's at that guy. Was it Manilov? What was the guy's name? Who was the house he was
the
at?
First one.
Yeah, where he was that the one where he first said he wanted to buy the souls from? Okay, so and then there's just like a screeching halt of like where it actually becomes extremely dark, and he's because they're having a great time, and he brought him into his house, his wife, and everything, and then he's asking for these dead souls. It was just it was like a screeching halt, and it was very cool how that just like a pivot and emotion.
Well, yeah. Oh, interesting. I don't know if I experienced it as much of a pivot. I mean, it was a big reveal because prior to that, we had been told explicitly that we'll be told later why he's doing the thing that he's doing. And that's the first time we see, but also we don't know. We're not told exactly why he's doing it. But I still found their whole exchange really fun. I mean, there's so much humor in their exchange over that. And it in terms of the SNL sketch of going from person to person, one of the things that'll be interesting is just the difference in the characters' reactions to his request and what methods of persuasion he has to use with them based on their personality. So with, oh my gosh, with Manilov, or however you say his name, it was,
I probably said,
is this legit, basically? Is it, this doesn't sound right. And he says, oh, it's right. And he's like, okay, that's all I need to hear. And then he's convinced, just a declaration that it's right is all he needs. And then the old woman, I guess it was that he's a government, he has government contracts, I think was the turning point for her. I'm a guy with government contracts. Oh, well, I guess that lends him an official stature and also means he's going to come back and buy her hemp. So, and she was just concerned with being cheated. Anyway.
Well, I just want to say too, that maybe I'm thinking more from his perspective because he was blindsided by that, but it didn't take long for that to be restored to his, previous state. That's the funny part. Cause there's like, there's like a suspension there. He's like, wait, what? And then he's like, don't worry about it. It's not as sinister and as dark as you think. He's like, oh, okay.
Yes.
So,
well, we could go into the characters now, unless there's so anybody want to give an attempt of what is, let's see, what was the phrase? What's proverbial about Chichikov? It seems the scene that, well, some of the scenes that stand out most as capturing his character for me are, I'll just go straight to this whole scene where, okay, so he goes around trying to identify who are all the officials and landholders and who's going to have these souls available to him, though first we just know he's trying to track down all the local officials. And it says, this is on page 16 for me, the newcomer was quite at his ease on every occasion and showed himself an experienced man of the world. Whatever the subject of conversation, he could always keep it up. I think about Peter Keating and badminton. If you need to know badminton, if the person's interested in badminton, then you become an expert overnight. Were horse breeding discussed? He'd talk about horse breeding. If they conversed about the best dogs, on that subject too, he made very apt observations. If they touched on a case inquired into by the court of justice, he showed that he was not ignorant of court procedure. If the topic were a game of billiards, he was not at sea in billiards either. If the conversation turned upon virtue, he made excellent reflections upon virtue, and even with tears in his eyes. Upon the preparation of hot punch, he was authority on punch too. So we've gone from horse breeding to billiards to dogs to virtue, and then back to punch. Upon the overseers of customs and excise officers, he discoursed about them too, as though he had been himself an excise officer or overseer of the customs. He knew very well how to behave. He spoke neither too loud nor too low, but exactly as he ought. Take him how you would, he was a thoroughly gentlemanly man. Seems like a lot of his identity is captured in that description. Any other thoughts about his essence or moments that capture who he is? Ray?
Yeah, well, one difference from Peter Keating is, he's definitely doing, as Stephen said, as a chameleon. He's going from one form to another, just like we're reminded of with Peter Keating. But one difference is that with Peter, it's like he's sort of, that's an end in itself. Like he just wants the plaudits of other people. And here it's like, okay, well, he's actually trying to con his way, and he actually is trying to get some dead souls. I don't know exactly where we're going with this, but there's something else there. So I actually still find him to be a bit shadowy in a sense of I don't quite know what he's about. As in, just one thing that I find very curious is the way he just rips down a poster and then just reads it by himself in his room. I'm like, is disappointed there's nothing on the back to read. And it's like I'm not quite sure what he's about yet. But yeah, he's definitely a slippery character.
Yes. Sarah?
Yeah, just building off of what Ray was saying, I think the way I took his characterization, he seemed more like an opportunistic person rather than a malicious person. So the people that he is ripping off are not the people he's buying the dead souls from. It's more like he's found this loophole in some sort of government or regulatory edict, and he's going to take advantage of it. But yeah, unlike with Peter Keating, it's not like I felt like I wanted to condemn him for his being a chameleon. It was more like I'm watching him work the room. He's just very political, and he's very strategic, and he's sort of laying some groundwork that I'm not sure what it's about, and then we find out later what it is.
Yeah. Thanks for making the distinction. I definitely did not mean to compare him to Keating in any essential sense. I think that was just the nature of the strategy that he used. But so he's not sinister. He doesn't seem sinister, but he does seem manipulative and calculating, and his means of manipulating these people is to be everything to everyone, just adapt to their interests and their identity and their personality. And then this is where it just becomes difficult to capture the nuances of his character. But why did it seem perfect to me, this description? He spent an extremely long time scrubbing his cheeks with soap, putting his tongue into them and making them stand out, taking a towel off the shoulder of the waiter, wiped his face in all directions, beginning from behind his ears, first giving 2 snorts right in the face of the waiter. Then he put on his shirt front before the looking glass, tweaked out 2 hairs that were protruding from his nose, and immediately after that attired himself in a short cranberry colored dress coat. That makes me feel like I know him, I know him much better. And I don't know how to put that into words. We wouldn't see Keating tweaking out nose hairs. Part of it is just to give an absurdity to his character, because all of Gogol's characters are a little bit absurd. So we're going to see them do things that we wouldn't ordinarily see a character do, because he's going to delight in the humor of the nuances of that scene. I mean, you can see it in a comedy. I don't actually know much about this comedian at all, but I keep picturing Mr. Bean. Does anybody know who Mr. Bean is? Does that bring him to mind at all? I feel like you'd see him sticking his tongue in his cheeks and tweaking out his nose hairs, but I don't know how to describe what the nature of that sort of character is. Stefan?
There was something in that I think it was early on. I don't know if he was at that restaurant, but I found it kind of exhausting that he ate all this food and indulged all this food and then just went out about his business, which I thought was kind of weird. Because then he went out and he like did his work, and after, to me, it just made me tired just thinking about all that he just ate. And I don't know, I think that's just something he just kind of, I don't want to say he's gluttonous, because he's not. It's probably not a good word to put it, but I don't know, he's just still driven, even though he just bogged himself down with this massive meal and drink. So that's just something that struck me. I don't know why, because I get tired if I have a whole dinner and dessert and coffee, I'm not doing anything. So that's all.
Right.
I just have to comment to Stefan that I'm a person who, when I go to a restaurant, I want to feel full at the end. I'm deeply disappointed if I don't feel like I'm bursting. So I'm very sympathetic to Chichikov on that.
Okay. We can add this to the montage of Ray confessions. Okay, so let's see. I also did it stand out to you, the description of Chichikov's soapbox at all? Because at the bottom of the description of the soapbox, I wrote, is the soapbox Chichikov's soul? There was something about it that seemed like it was capturing, I don't know, let's see, what's in the soapbox. There was the internal arrangement. In the middle was a box for soap. Above the soapbox, 6 or 7 narrow divisions for razors. Then square places for a sandbox and an ink pot with a little boat hollowed out between them for pens, sealing wax, and things that were rather longer. Then various divisions with covers and without covers for things that were shorter, full of visiting cards, funeral cards, theater tickets, and other things kept as souvenirs. All the upper tray with its little division lifted out, and under it, there was a space filled with packets of sheets of paper, then followed a little secret drawer for money, which came out of the side of the case. Like at the bottom of his soul is the secret drawer for money. I don't know. That's what it felt like to me. Stefan and Ray, hands are still up. Did you still have things to say? No? Okay. Any other thoughts about Chichikov? All right, well, how about, okay, so there was Petrushka and Cellophane, the 2 servants, who, let's see, yeah, it's not customary to give attention to these sorts of characters, but we're going to stop on them anyway. And the description of Petrushka honestly might have made me laugh harder than any other. I don't know. I laughed a lot in this book, but I really laughed at the idea that, okay, so we need to describe these two servants. This, however, will not take up much time and space, since we need not add much to what the reader knows already. That is, that Petrushka wore a rather roomy brown coat that had been his master's. So we don't need to say much more about this character to understand him other than his roomy brown coat. But we do say a few more things about him that are very funny. He liked to read. Everybody recalls the description of his enjoyment of reading. He liked to read not so much what he read as the reading itself, or rather the process of reading. So as I listened to this on audiobook when I was in a road trip, and I felt like I was hanging on each added phrase in this sentence, because he liked to read, not so much the reading itself. Okay, what does it mean to like to read if not for the reading itself? Rather, the process of reading. Okay, what does that mean exactly? The fact that the letters continually made up a word, and the devil knows what it sometimes might mean. What a hilarious description. I don't think I've ever heard a character as loving to read because they delight in seeing the letters form into words. And who cares what it means beyond that? All right. And so the only other two things we need to know about him are that he slept in his coat and he had a really pronounced odor that he carried with him from place to place. Let's see, got some comments. Shoshana.
Yeah, I think that what Gogol's doing is he's giving you a few little buttonholes, things that you can hold in your head. And you think, okay, now here comes the smell, and someone's going to notice the smell, and so on. I mean, it feels very much like something that you might see on stage where people have tics. Or someone might have a lisp or a stutter or something, and you know that a certain word is coming, and oh, that person's going to have trouble with that. So
and indeed, Manilov's wife has a stutter.
That's right. Yeah, and I think the writer he reminds me of, whom you might know, is Dickens, because that's something Dickens does also. Is he? And Dickens also wrote plays, although they weren't as famous as Gogol's Inspector General, but just, the idea of, okay, I'm going to tell you something, because he doesn't describe characters in terms of their values in the way that you might expect.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, they're recognizable. And
so defining them in terms of personal quirks as opposed to.
And funny names sometimes. I mean, some of Manilov's a funny name, sort of sweet, bland, uninflected. Korobochka's box-like, and so he gives. I think it's another reason why they become proverbial. Is that they've got
interesting.
Yeah, and
something I would never notice.
And it's a Dickens thing too. His characters sometimes have ridiculous names that no human being would actually have. So I think it just the book slows you down, and maybe that's also a reason why you laugh, because you wouldn't laugh at a summary.
You really need to see these details. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. And I think one thing, just when you were mentioning about the words, because you mentioned the overcoat, that's part of the humor of that character, is that his job is being a copy person, and so for him, words don't count as words count as his job. And just putting it on paper. And I think there's a sentence in there about he didn't know if he was in the middle of the sentence or in the middle of the street.
Yes.
And you wouldn't ordinarily confuse being in the middle of a sentence in the middle of a street, but it's kind of funny if you picture the middle of a sentence being something that's a physical thing.
Yes.
So I think that's part of what's going on with the quirks, is that they're manifested physically. We enjoy that.
Molly?
Yeah, I wonder if one of the things that he's making fun of is writing and writers.
Mm,
just sort of at a meta level.
mm,
That when he says things like, so much could be said about Petrushka, and then goes on to describe someone else, that
mhm,
he's aware of his own writing process and kind of wants you to be aware of it too.
mm,
What I'm writing about right now, and now I'm going to write about something else, and I'm going to take your attention away, as if it's just happening outside of him, as if he's not in charge. Or he'll say, God knows what he was thinking. Well, it's your character and you're the right person, you know. So just punching up our attention to that aspect of a book.
Well, there does. So sometimes it seems focused on quirks of society, but I do want to watch now for the focus on conventions of writing, because it does, he does, it's about society that you're not supposed to talk about these lesser characters who are unimportant. We in Russia aren't interested in that, but it also turns on its head what we're expecting from a novel.
Right.
We're expecting to have our focus on those sorts of characters. And I see, so this is another one of those things where I'm like, I'm going to destroy this scene by talking about it, but it's so funny and trying to get underneath what is so funny about it. But when he introduces Manilov's wife, and oh gosh, I've got to find the exact line. He says, so on page 24, so he goes on, starts his description of Manilov, which is maybe my favorite description of any character of all so far. But he says, he gets to his wife and he says, his wife was, however, they were thoroughly satisfied with each other. So you're on that. Okay, tell us about his wife. Well, let's not talk about her.
Well, you know.
Why?
And he does say a little bit about her later, but just that moment of we have this expectation, and then it's almost like we shouldn't talk about her.
It's like what you would say in a conversation rather than what you would write formally in a book.
Yes.
He's talking to you as if he's having tea with you rather than.
And like as soon as it's out of his mouth that he starts to talk about her, he has misgivings about finishing. They were really happy together. Let's leave it at that.
Right.
Ray?
Yeah, just on the reading and not knowing the words. There is actually, I do remember a novella by Aldous Huxley where there was a character who would who was reading Persian, and he just liked it as the puzzle. It's just like it didn't matter whether he's reading Rumi or in Persian, just as long as this guy. Now, that was to basically say he's an incredibly boring person, tedious. Well, that's what Huxley was doing. But here it's like, no, that's just really
Oh, lost a connection with her. We'll have to see if he comes back.
Like it's
we
it's
get
laughable.
Just if you want a message,
but it's cute in a way, and it's
Ray,
can you hear me now?
You were cutting out for
a
bit.
Okay. Am I back now?
Yeah, it seems like you're back now.
Okay. Let's hope I stay back.
I know. Let's hope.
But it's just like contrasting it with Flaubert. Like I can just see a similar scene of, I don't know, like maybe what is it? I'm trying to remember the name of the character that had the thing you make vases with, or whatever it was. It was just like it spins around and makes that big humming, hissing sound. Like that's something that Flaubert then says, Benet, that was it. And it's like that character is basically just stupid for wanting to do this incredibly tedious activity, which you get satisfaction out of. Like you get that at the very end of the novel. And here it's like, oh, well, he reads and he doesn't understand, but we like
the
him.
book is the marker is always on page 14. It doesn't really move from that spot. That was in his description too. Oh, did we lose Ray? Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about Manilov, if I'm saying his name correctly. I think he can be summed up pretty well as cloyingly agreeable. That to combine a few of the different descriptions of him and a lot of the key moments with him. There's more to him than that, but if I had to reduce him down to an essence, cloyingly agreeable would be it. This description early on. In appearance, he was good looking. The features of his countenance were rather agreeable, but in that agreeableness, there was an overdose of sugar. In his deportment and manners, there was something that betrayed an anxiety to win goodwill and friendship. Oh my gosh, I loved this sequence. So when you first meet him, you would say, what a kind and agreeable man. The next minute, one would say nothing. And the third minute, one would say, what the devil is one to make of it? And would walk away. If one did not walk away, one would be aware of a deadly boredom. Agreeable to the point of deadly boredom. And then I love how we're not just told that abstractly. It is played out again and again in the most hilarious of ways, one of which is the two of them standing in the door, unable to progress through the door because each is trying to let the other go first, because Chichikov is trying to be agreeable opportunistically, and Manilov, it just seems like a inescapable and fundamental trait of being always agreeable. So nobody can cross the threshold of the door. And then the other, again, laughed so hard at this 2-page conversation. It could have gone on longer and I still would have been laughing. Talking about all the various government officials. He's really a most estimable and genial man, a most estimable man. Then the next one, a most affable and agreeable man. Oh, he's a charming man. Next one, a most worthy man. He is an agreeable man, extremely, and it just goes on and on and on with them saying absolutely nothing except bland, empty, flattering phrases, often which they repeat. The other one just said the exact same thing and they just repeat it. So I guess they were physically stuck in the door. Here, they're just verbally, conversationally stuck in saying anything other than agreeable and affable. And then this is where my phrase came from. And do you know Pavel Ivanovich, forgive my Russian pronunciation, said Manilov, while his face wore an expression not merely sweet, but sickly, cloying sweet, like a dose some tactful society doctor has mercilessly oversweetened, thinking to gratify his patient. That's an amazing description. When kids have to take antibiotics or something, they have this incredibly disgusting, syrupy, sweet stuff that they mix it with to try to make it palatable to them. And that now is the essence of Manilov's character in my mind. Ray, did you have something still?
Hopefully.
Yeah, good luck.
Yeah, I wanted to call Manilov Vanilov because of just the blandness of him. But I just, one thing other about him is he's just so perfectly Russian in his impotence. Just the way he's, it's like, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful to make an underground tunnel? And wouldn't it be nice to have a little merchant shop for all the the serfs to buy things? And oh, isn't that a wonderful daydream? That's just such a great, just never following through on what he's going to do. That's it fits in so well.
So he's just idle but affable. So when people come in to ask him questions about what to do, he's just like, yeah, I don't know. He doesn't have any ideas, but he's perfectly friendly in his manner of managing them.
Yeah, he's just, it's I guess you could, I guess as He never finishes a book. You know, he's got the same book on the page 14 for however many years. And the other character just reads but doesn't know what it says.
Yes, exactly. So let's see. I also love this. It's funny because they're stuck again because it's always by bending over backwards to be the friendly and accommodating them sets them at a stalemate constantly. So there was this description where it says, oh, Pavel Ivanovich, I would gladly give my fortune to possess some of the qualities with which you are endowed. On the contrary, I for my part should esteem it the greatest. And then there is no saying what pitch the mutual outpouring of sentiment between these two friends might have reached had not a servant entered to announce a meal. So it just would have kept escalating and each one trying to outdo the other in praise, in empty praise. Thankfully, a meal interrupted it. Oh, and okay, so these are the sort of little details that whether or not they reveal anything about the character, I just find so brilliant. I guess this is that thing about enjoying this sheer narration of it, enjoying seeing the world. If Anne is beauty loving eyes, these are humor loving eyes, just seeing what is delightfully comedic in the world. So I loved the phrase describing Manielov, that he sucked his pipe as if trying to draw an opinion out of it. You can see someone just buying time to deal with the situation by sucking long on their pipe. But the description of trying to draw an opinion about it out of it, that's such a good insightful way to describe that moment. Joseph, see if anybody else has a comment. I need to go rescue my dog for a moment. Give me 1 second.
Yeah, anyone else want to comment on it or have anything else? I'll read a few. Oh, Shoshana.
Mute. Okay, I haven't thought of this in years, but I'm pretty sure it's a true memory that Gogol himself was a character, something like these people he depicted. And I think this is a true story, that when he was trying to teach, he was so bad at teaching that no one wanted to listen to him. And so he kind of dressed himself up as if he had a toothache, so that would be an excuse not to talk, and that he went in and basically, sort of wore a scarf around his head when he tried to teach. Now, that's the kind of thing that if you read it in a novel, you'd think, oh yeah, that's Gogol being funny, but I think it's a true story. That, he was supposed to be teaching, and so, but he couldn't do it, and so he kind of wore this scarf around him so that it would be a good excuse for not teaching. And it gets worse. I mean, if you read about his life, the end of his life was quite sad. He apparently was disturbed. And you probably read about how he tried to burn the second part of Dead Souls a few times. So I know we don't sort of read people's lives into their works, but I'm guessing here that he's not as distant as you might think from these characters, but that he was accustomed to thinking, well, I'm living in a world full of weird stuff. And I'm weird too. Yeah. So I have to say, I've had days when I thought, gee, I don't feel like going in. Maybe I could have a toothache like Gogol. But I've never actually done it. So that's it.
Mary Elaine.
Yeah, and to follow up on what Shoshana said, I think Gogol was only 43 when he died. So, which seems very sad to me. But I thought this kind of explains some of the social protocol in the Russian social society. In 1722, Peter the Great established 14 official ranks in civil service. And I'll just read you like the first several. It's just ludicrous. And this is from most important to least important. Chancellor, actual privy counselor, actual state counselor, collegiate counselor, court counselor, and it keeps going. It's just, and there are levels of deference that goes with each of these 14 positions in the civil service, which explains some of the manners in, yeah, it's just bizarre.
Yeah. Yeah. So that goes very well with that scene about, let's see, where was that? Let me just find that one really quickly. Well, actually, I won't find it quickly. But this scene that described the subtle distinctions in conversational mannerisms according to somebody's rank, that everybody ought to have a mastery of that, or everybody in Russian society does have a mastery of that. And also, I loved the part about Prometheus and the partridge, or Prometheus and the fly. So not only do you have to be aware of these subtle distinctions, but your own regard for your position shifts according to the crowd in which you find yourself. Let us suppose, for instance, there is a government office, not here, but in some fairy kingdom, not here. I'm not talking about here. And let us suppose that in the office, there is a head of the office. I beg you to look at him when he's sitting among his subordinates. One is simply too awe-stricken to utter a word, pride and dignity, and what else is not expressed upon his face? You should take a brush and paint him a Prometheus, a perfect Prometheus. He looks like an eagle. He moves with a measured step. That very eagle, when he has left his own room and is approaching the sanctum of his chief, flutters along like a partridge with papers under his arm as best he may. In company and at an evening party, if all present are of low rank, Prometheus remains Prometheus. But if they are ever so little above him, Prometheus undergoes a metamorphosis such as Ovid never imagined. He is a fly, less than a fly indeed. He humbles himself into the dust. Oh, that's brilliant, hilarious, and I think really that there is definitely that recurring theme of station in society being eminently important. But there's also just, again, this is one of those where you can picture the physical action of it, like you said, Shoshana, that you see him walking from one context to another, and everything about his bearing and posture and expression and it changes in a moment. Joseph, who do we have?
Molly and Steve.
Oh, thanks, Joseph. Yeah, about the stations. I was wondering if anyone else noticed something about the transaction itself when he started talking about the souls. And that is, they mention how worthless they all are. Like they say, they're not worth anything. But on the previous page, like the old woman talks about the guy who burned up from inside. It was like grotesquely hilarious. But he was a great blacksmith and he was wonderful. But in the next breath, they say, well, none of them are worth anything. Why do you want them? And he tells Manilov, like, how many did you have? And he goes, well, I don't know. He says, well, count them, figure it all out. So first, I wonder if anyone else noticed, but also that I'm paying attention to this because I have a feeling in Ray's Woody Allen kind of world, this is going to get heightened over the course of the story. It's going to get more and more absurd, the transaction itself.
Why on earth? The question of why you would want them.
Right. And I think that's going to get even weird. I'm looking forward to it. It's going to get even weirder and more Woody Allen-like, I think. So I don't know.
There was this one line where he says, if only you knew the service that with those apparently worthless souls you are doing to a man of no rank or family. Now he's making an emotional appeal, but also I had to wonder, well, there has to be something he's getting out of these.
Yeah, the suspense. I don't know. I don't quite know what he wants. I can kind of glimpse it, but he's going.
According to the old lady, he's assuming the tax burden.
Right.
Of each.
But I don't. That's not the story. No. Yeah.
Right.
So anyway.
Ray.
Yeah, just on the issue of, I guess, class and sort of the social critique side of it, I get the feeling with Gogol that, he's sort of like saying, "Oh, isn't it absurd the way we do things this and that way?" But it's very, I feel like maybe naturalistic of it's like, well, that's just the way things are, and he's accepting of it. Of you can see him, that he himself cringes like that. That he himself is, sputters back and forth between different people, and the apology isn't like he's not making like we're like, oh, I'm going to talk about people of the lower class. I feel like, well, he is actually apologizing for it on some level. He's like, well, I'm going to be dealing with these little people, but forgive me. We'll get past them eventually. So it's sort of acknowledging that there's absurdity or there's maybe some injustice there, but it's like that's the way things are, and I'm accepting of that standard. And don't be patient with me.
No, I appreciate that, because I think that, again, when I read The Overcoat, I think I went in with the expectation that there's going to be social commentary there. And so that's what I was looking for first and foremost. And there is social commentary, so you can find it if that's what you're looking for and your expectation is that's what's going to be central to it. But then going back to the story, it was, okay, there's social commentary, but that's not the focus. The focus is more this lens of kind of identifying, the lens of kind of zeroing in on this little man in society who's completely overlooked. And it's not primarily a social commentary he's doing that, but just as the desire of a writer to showcase the interesting characters and quirks of these people who are typically overlooked. And then reading it again, it was, okay, but that is just mostly in service of humor too. That was kind of the sequence I went through. Like, it's social commentary. No, it's really not, but he really wants to highlight these characters' quirks. And then it was, yeah, he wants to do that because it's so entertaining and funny. And I sort of started to think of him as a stand-up comedian with a bit. And a lot of stand-up comedy shows, especially if they're, the Netflix style organized into a show, they do have commentary involved. And the commentary involved is important. It's central. It's really defining of and central to the identity of their show. But it's humor. The purpose of it is to make you laugh. It's not fundamentally to communicate that theme. That's how I feel when I'm reading Gogol. That
what I'd say about it is that I would agree with you that the social commentary that's tertiary. But I would say that my feeling is the focus is on the characters and what they're like, and he likes to have the comedy because that's just the way he feels about the world and the way these people are and interact with it.
No, that's, I mean, but how do we capture? I agree with you, but it's almost like that's his personal comedic style. That's what he likes to focus on as comedy, is their quirks. But what the distinction I'm trying to make and be careful of is that I thought with The Overcoat, initially the feeling was like he wants you to take away a serious theme about this character, and he's using humor as a device to do that. And then I started to think more, no, his identity as a writer is that he delights in what's entertaining or humorous or interesting or quirky about these characters. And so there's not, do you see the distinction I'm trying to make?
No, I see this like what is the writer really about? Like, what's sort of the core of what he wants to display about the world, and what are sort of more the things maybe he cares about but are, again, secondary or more the means. And I feel like here I'm just reminded of H.L. Mencken in a review of Ring Lardner's short stories. He said that one thing about Lardner's very funny. And he has lots of jokes in his books, in his short stories, but that the jokes always ring true to the character. They aren't just like sort of maybe a
Oh, yeah.
Broadway joke where it's
Yeah.
like, oh, the character says something funny and it doesn't relate to the character. I
Mhm.
feel like here it's like, no, Gogol, he really is invested in the soul of the characters, and he feels that soul is just so funny.
Mhm.
Maybe maybe this dichotomy we have here is, we don't have to have it as a dichotomy. If he wants to show how funny the foibles of humanity are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like he really cares about both the humanity part and
Yeah.
the foibles and funniness of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that way of describing it. Shoshana?
Yeah. I read it years ago, but there's and I just found it on Google. There is an article about Gogol and Dickens' stand-up comics.
Oh,
So,
really?
yeah,
Oh
yeah,
my gosh, I'll have to look that up.
yeah. Well, it looks as if I got to get it from behind a paywall, but I read it years ago, and yeah, there's something sort of talkiness about them, that they're
Mhm.
there and they're talking at you, which is of course why you need to slow down,
Mhm.
because you need to read it at the speed of speech as opposed to
Mhm.
the speed of reading. And I think you're right in that there's a question as to how much are we supposed to feel, because with Dickens there is a kind of cruelty to the laughter,
Mhm.
and sometimes, and I think that you could say that with Gogol also there's a kind of cruelty to the laughter, but it's also as if the laughter is on the naive person, and the reader's not supposed to be naive.
Mhm.
The reader is supposed to be tuned in.
Mhm.
That's it.
Yeah.
But
So I think this is why I felt like I needed to make the kind of Netflix set comparison. I feel like if I draw out any particular show, I'm going to be doing a disservice to Gogol. But I'm thinking of like the recent Dave Chappelle Netflix show. There's a lot of very serious social commentary within it. But if you told Dave Chappelle, like, your goal in life is to get across a serious social message, I'm quite sure he would say you've misidentified him entirely. He's about humor, and that's where it feels like the balance is with Gogol. You could use humor in the service of communicating a really serious social message, or you could have sophisticated humor that actually is meaningful and substantive because it contains social commentary within it. And the primacy for me feels like it's on humor and not on social commentary. Sarah.
I put it in the chat, but just in terms of like what brand of stand-up comedian is Gogol, I think he's way more of a Jerry Seinfeld than like a George Carlin. His commentary is much less biting and much more silly. And I think it's less of like making fun of others and more of like pointing fun at ourselves.
Yeah, that would be interesting to think about the style of comedy in relation to modern comedians, because there was just something. I was just talking to Joseph recently about your voice on recording, about everybody has the experience of hearing your voice on recording and finding it unpleasant or unexpected in some way. And I said, there's a Seinfeld episode about that where George Costanza, he says he can't read because when he reads, he hears his own voice in his head, and that makes it unbearable for him. So he orders books on tape, and then the books on tape come and it's his voice on the actual tapes. Now that is a iconic, hilarious scene, but those are the Seinfeld things, to like the loud talker, the close talk, the sort of conventional quirks of humanity. We're going to draw those out and laugh about them in a really benevolent way. So I like the Seinfeld comparison. I think Chappelle came to mind because Seinfeld does tend to be kind of trivial aspects of human existence, there do seem to be more bigger social themes here. But anyway, yeah, that's a fun topic to think about. Ray.
Yeah, actually, just I thought of it. I think actually it fits very well with Frasier, because it's just the characters are just they're very very neurotic, very enthusiastic, or just distorted in a certain way, but they're all really well-meaning, and there's real soul to them. Just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, I
Okay.
like
So let's see, did anybody want to say anything about Madame Menilov or the old lady that, there's I think, I don't know, part of the old lady's identity was the type that puts tidy sums away in drawers. So she talks as if she has nothing, but she has been steadily and carefully putting away those tidy sums in drawers, and she's always concerned, seems focused on the bottom line and concerned that somebody might be financially cheating her. I don't know, anybody have any comments on her? Ray?
I just hope that no poor young university student comes by and gets any ideas about her.
Might want to tickle his feet. She might want to tickle his feet.
No, we're Raskolnikov. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so it seems like just like he focuses on or draws out the quirks of people, he also just draws out the quirks in physical surroundings almost. One of the details that jumped out at me from the early pages was the descriptions of those beetles crawling out of the inn room looking like prunes. The description of beetles like prunes crawling out of the walls is a very, very memorable one. What purpose does it serve? I mean, it creates an atmosphere of this conventional inn that we've just found ourselves inside of, but I don't know what the purpose of it is beyond that sort of color. And then another one that comes to mind in that category is just the chorus of dogs. I forget which house that was at, but it described every pitch in the chorus of dogs. Why did we take that tangent? I don't really know, but it was very entertaining. Ray.
Yeah, I just had to bring up that chorus of dogs, a little tireless falsetto, puppy,
Yeah.
and like the deep tenor, just all of that, like that. Well, to me, the reason why it's there is because it's so Gogol, because
Yeah.
it's just because like that's just the world that Gogol lives in, where like when dogs are barking like that furiously, they're just playful, just like like the turkey who says gobbles thank
Gobbles,
God
yeah.
bless you, which is just that's just what Gogol's world is like. It's funny and adorable and absurd in numberless little ways. And
I think that is what gives him just the soul of a comedian too, is that if Anne from Anne of Green Gables heard the chorus of dogs, or Ellen Montgomery, the author, it would be rendered on the page much differently. She might notice something that we overlook and draw it out for us, but the tone of drawing it out would be so different. So Gogol seems like he finds humor in all of these things. I mean, it's just, that's the lens through which he looks at the world. Is there's so much about the world that's delightfully funny if you really pay attention to it.
I think I'm starting to come to your position more. It's like just the fact of having those details, like that doesn't clarify anything about Chichikov or the old woman or anything. Like those are just there because they're fun. And he just is very happy to go on a tangent that fits, is a tangent that belongs there. But that's because he's a very tangential person who just wants to talk about what he talks about.
Wendy.
there was another scene that struck me as I read it that's similar. It was comparing the party and the people in the men in the tuxedos to flies on a sugar loaf.
Oh, I love that.
And as I was reading it, though, I found myself in a strange position of trying to understand why are we, because it wasn't like just a metaphor, like a sentence or two. It went on and on. And I wasn't quite sure where.
Yes,
why, but
no, that is the adjustment, I think, of adapting to the world of this book, is you come to something like that, you realize, no, there's not some deeper agenda here. We just need to go with it. Just follow on his tangent. And it will be very, I mean, you started to mention that scene, and I know exactly what, it's so vivid, and you can completely picture that scene. And also it's hilarious because these are men in tuxedos, and now they've been reduced to flies on a sugar loaf with a brush stroke.
It definitely wasn't elevating of feel the elegance, feel the importance of this. I mean, if anything, maybe that's part of the point, is that no.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Well, I guess that is how I felt about a lot of the details of it, is that he does seem to often like to undermine the sense of grandeur of the upper classes. I mean, that does seem to be a recurring tone in the humor, but mostly I feel like he saw that scene and he thought, you know what that reminds me of? And he was tickled by the connection in his own mind. And then he describes it in a way that makes it equally delightful for the reader. So just include it. And that might be a little bit of why the description as surreal, because we really are being taken away from, if there's a central action to the story, it's him going from house to house trying to collect these dead souls, but we're taken in a million different directions from that central line, none of which add up to anything. So I think just not being on the premise that I need to be able to integrate these things into a whole, but just being kind of carried along on, I mean, I don't know, there's a visual metaphor is coming to my mind, but just almost like being on a scenic ride, like a Disneyland kind of ride, and then there's just this scene that you're focused on, but then you're moving on, and then there's another scene. It's not that there's some integrating purpose to it all. Ray.
Yeah, this is just a book that has too much. Just like all these little things are just too much to deal with. But I will say that on the integration point, I sort of think of it as these things don't integrate on the level of, oh, that says something about the character, and the character then adds something to the plot, and then the plot adds something to the theme. It's sort of like, all those things, like, they don't have those middle level abstractions, but they all add up to the same, like, yeah, that's just the Gogol-esque attitude towards things.
Yes.
Like,
they add up to a sense of life, or to a way of looking at the world.
It's like, yeah, that turkey doesn't say anything about anybody or move the plot forward, but it belongs.
Yes.
It needs to be there. It's a necessity, turkey.
No, okay, so we did manage to fill an hour and a half of discussion, and I found this extremely helpful. I think I'm going to go back to Gogol and enjoy it even more. Gosh, I mean, in terms of the volume of observation, of hilarious observations, it is too much to discuss, because we've gone through an hour and a half and have not mentioned thin men and fat men. I don't know how I let that pass by, because that was a favorite.
Or the passage on education, page 25.
Oh, the boarding school?
The importance of French.
Oh my gosh, I know. Or the card player, even the card player and his quirk of like, away with you, old priest's wife, every time you throw down card. It was so inessential to anything, and I loved it being there. I could picture that guy so much. So yeah, I'm just going to go into the next section, absolutely relishing and immersing myself in Gogol's observations of humanity. And there is something, we are worlds away from Madame Bovary. There is a benevolence to it. And so it does sort of promote a feeling of humanity underneath it, because if we're going to carry away a point of view, we'll be a little more attuned to what's kind of delightfully quirky and humorous in the world around us. That seems like a good perspective to absorb into our own characters and souls. All right, so next reading will be 3 more chapters, chapters 4 through 6. And I will see everyone next Sunday. Thank you for being here.